Good morning. Call to order our afternoon work session so that we can make sure that we cover this topic in full. We have the Raleigh Growth and Annexation and City Services Coverage Overview. That was a mouthful. Whoever wants to start.
So I will kind of tee it up for Pat Young, our Planning and Development Director. So basically, you guys will recall conversations that we've had in the past about continued growth and what service delivery models, current service delivery models will look like as we continue to grow and develop as a community. As part of that conversation, some services that we are required to provide, i.e. water, sewer, police and fire are ultimately impacted as our numbers and population continues to grow. One of the conversations that's been happening amongst staff over the last several months is the current trends of that growth. What does that look like, and what will the impact on our current service delivery and future service delivery models? And so today we have staff from Planning and Development as well as Raleigh Fire here to talk about some of those service impacts. So I will kick it over to Pat Young to kind of set the table for the conversation.
Thank you, Madam City Manager and Mayor Pro Tem and Council. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this important topic. The City Manager did a great job of kind of framing this out and teeing it up. I'm going to very briefly talk about kind of community growth and the tools that we've been given by the General Assembly to manage growth. Turn it over to my colleague, Christopher Golden, who will talk about previous council's policies and resolutions on annexation and kind of the policy context. He'll turn it over to Lorraine Eubanks of Raleigh Fire, talk about specifically dive into some of the fire service need challenges and opportunities in Southeast and Northeast Raleigh. And then finally, Bynum Walter of our team will close with some options for you all as you go forward. As you heard from the manager, and as you all very well know, we continue to grow here in Raleigh, and that is the underlying driver of some of the concerns you're going to hear about today. We grew by about 66,000 people between 2010 and 2020. It's about 18 people a day, and that growth rate has continued into this decade. A significant and growing share of that growth is what we call infill development, which is development on undeveloped lots in previously developed areas. And an increasing share is also redevelopment, which is essentially previously developed areas that are substantially or completely demolished and rebuilt. But there's still demand for and opportunity for significant what we call greenfield growth. Greenfield. Greenfield means land never previously developed. And that's primarily in areas southeast of our current city limits and northeast of our city limits. Before I proceed, I did want to kind of have two framing facts that pertain to this. The cost of greenfield development to municipalities is typically higher than the cost of redevelopment or infill development. And that's because typically new infrastructure and services are required, and of course staffing to go with those for areas that were not previously served and that are primarily rural or exurban in nature, whereas areas of redevelopment or infill often need service enhancements, but those are kind of retrofits or modifications to existing facilities. So the concurrent of that, the opposite of that, or concurrent with that, is that greenfield development is also often more affordable, and therefore there's high demand for more affordable opportunities for growth. And then the other piece of context is that through planning efforts with Wake County and our 13 peer municipalities here in Wake County, over the last 35 years or so, we have the city's envisioned growing into significant areas of Wake County to the southeast and northeast. And cumulatively, those areas are almost twice the size of inside the Beltline Raleigh. So for context, very large areas that were planned for our future growth with our partners over the past many years. The immediate key issue that's driving growth in the southeast and northeast area is the construction of I-540, which will make these areas more accessible to more locations within the triangle. That's planned to be underway within the next several years by 2026. This fact combined with the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that the lowest cost land in our city's jurisdiction or area is in those southeast and northeast areas. So there's tremendous opportunities for growth and demand for growth in those areas. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, the state has given us a set of tools that we, through General Statutes 160A, to manage growth. And I'll quickly go over each of those and then turn it over to Christopher to talk about what the city has done policy-wise. First, we'll start with the corporate city limits. Corporate is just a fancy word for city. It's the city limits. For all legal purposes, it's the city of Raleigh. Raleigh regulates land through zoning and the Unified Development Ordinance. For services that we provide, we are obligated to serve all lands located within the city limits. And so the examples on the slide there, water and sewer, police, fire, roads, solid waste. Essentially, the General Assembly said that if you're going to provide the services, you have to provide them across the community. It may come as a surprise, but the only service we're legally required to provide is enforcement of state building code and also stormwater management due to our size. That's a federal requirement. But we provide those other services, and therefore, if we bring someone into the city through annexation, we are required to provide those services. So I'll also quickly mention there are two subcategories of corporate limits. There's contiguous, which means that it's surrounded on all sides by other parts of the city. And there's what's called satellite, which means that it's not directly touching other parts of the city, but that and there's within state law, there are specified limits under which that can occur. So annexation is the process of adding new areas to the city. That's how we grow at our edges. Prior to 2011, we had the authority to do what's called involuntary annexation. And that had tremendous benefits for cities in North Carolina because through our extraterritorial jurisdiction or ETJ authority, which I'll talk about in a minute, we could control growth. And once there got to be a critical mass, a large enough amount of growth, we could go and kind of mass annex and have more efficient service delivery. 2011, there was a very significant change to state law that basically said annexation has to be strictly voluntary on the part of property owners, with very few exceptions. And that has really changed the model which we need to plan for services. And it's particularly challenging given the fact that the cost of service provision is kind of front-loaded and the revenues or benefits from service provision are back-loaded. So that's created this challenge that we're bringing to you today. If once a property is annexed, once there's an effective date for annexation, all of the city services, with the exception of water and sewer, have to be provided on the day of annexation. So that includes fire, police, solid waste. For practical purposes, water and sewer service is needed for fire service in the vast majority of cases. And so therefore, without water and sewer availability, there would likely have to be mutual aid agreement or partnership or temporary solution to provide that service. So for effective purposes, we need to have a plan and ensure that we can serve these areas effectively. Next, I'll talk about our urban service areas. That is not a term in the state law. That is something that we've worked with our partners in Wake County and our 13 other municipalities to come up with. Essentially, it's a set of negotiated agreements between Wake County and the municipalities about where each of the communities will grow in the future. And this context has been in place for many years and was reiterated and enhanced in 2021 with the Plan Wake, which was the most recent Wake County comprehensive plan. You all will see the Southeast Special Study Area again in detail. We're asking you to schedule a hearing for that item today, and we'll go into these details for the Southeast area in more detail. This is a close-up of the Southeast area. That area you see in the middle there and kind of the tan is the Raleigh tract, which was purchased by Wake County and the city of Raleigh several years ago. But all that surrounding area is not in our extraterritorial jurisdiction, but within our utility service area, which just means that Wake County and our peer municipalities have allowed us and only us to be the community who would annex or provide services in that area. The area in the lighter tan to the bottom left of the slide is the Phase 1 area for the CESA, that was the first area planned for extraterritorial jurisdiction or ETJ expansion. And Christopher will talk a little bit about that since there was some policy around that recently. So the formal way, and this is in state law, that we memorialize these are annexation agreements. And we have annexation agreements with all of our surrounding jurisdictions that are shown on the slide there that specify exactly where they have the authority to annex and where we have the authority to annex. And Wake County has been a high-level participant and has kind of convened and managed this process. And it's, like I said, been in place for many years. I think I might have inadvertently skipped the extraterritorial jurisdiction conversation. That is a part of the community, and I'll turn it over to Christopher. That's the light gray on this slide, kind of in the middle. The dark gray is corporate limits. It's just an example. And then the tan is in the unincorporated part of the county. Extraterritorial jurisdiction is a tool that provides Raleigh the authority and all other municipalities to regulate land use, but we have no legal obligation to provide services in that area. We have decided through policy to provide water and sewer services in that area if annexation is denied. And the state has set the rules very explicitly for these. So I want to make sure I covered that. So I hope I've given you an overview and context of the environment that we're in. This is a close-up on that northeast area on your left and the southeast area on your right that are in question and where you have a number of annexations coming before you in the coming months. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christopher to talk about prior council's policy and resolutions on this topic.
Thank you, Pat. Good afternoon. Christopher Golden. I manage the annexation program in planning and development, comprehensive planning, as you all know, but for the benefit of people who might be live streaming and people in the audience who are listening today. So I wanted to talk a bit about some of the policies that the city has in terms of growth management. I'm going to focus on two things initially, the comprehensive plan and some resolutions that we have that pertain to when and when we will not accept an annexation petition. So the first slide that you see here relates to policies that we have in the comprehensive plan. And we have a total of 5 policies that deal with zoning and requiring zoning consistency with future land use map. Talks about location of growth. The policy of the city is to develop within city jurisdictions first, and then go out to the periphery into those USAs, areas not areas that often are less urbanized. Pat had touched upon annexation agreements, which are also referenced in the comprehensive plan. And from the city's point of view, we support and honor those agreements, and we renew and negotiate when needed, and infrastructure concurrency. And that just essentially says that development, we would only approve development in areas that have appropriate infrastructure in place. And for terms of infrastructure, we're talking about transportation, water, wastewater, stormwater. Also watershed management, which is incredibly important. So when that relates to annexations, we want to make sure that any annexed lands in the watershed are being managed to minimize impervious surface coverage and protect water quality, and being in accordance with any watershed plans we have, particularly in Falls Lake and in Swift Creek. So I'll move to the next slide, and this is where we get to actual city policy that deals with annexation petitions and when we will and will not accept policy. So we have 3 main resolutions that pertain to that. The first was in 2008, and essentially that just says that we wouldn't accept any annexation petitions outside of the ETJ or areas that were being formally considered for ETJ extension. There's some geographic exceptions on that based on utility boundaries, watershed boundaries, also for emergency connections, and also for public-owned lands and municipality transfers. Those are pretty rare. So that was pretty restrictive, but in 2009, there was another resolution that amended 2008. So what that did is allowed the city to accept annexation petitions for properties outside of the ETJ where the property is contiguous to the city limits and in close, very important, in close proximity to those existing water and sewer lines. So the most recent amendment to 2008 and 2009 came in 2022, and that pertains mainly to the Auburn-Knightdale case that'll be coming up on the 21st to council. And that allows for the acceptance of annexation petitions on a case-by-case basis where it's adjacent to those satellite limits. In this case, it would be the Raleigh track in the southeast portion of Raleigh, in that urban service area. And it's in an area formally being considered for extension of Raleigh's ETJ within the next 5 years, and that's the case with the recommendations in the CESA study. Also, it needs to be adjacent or close to existing City Raleigh water and sewer lines. So, on the next slide, we're going to be looking at, or the next 2 slides, I should say, we're going to be looking at a series of cases that you're going to see coming before council beginning on March 21st and 1 or 2 after. 8 cases total. The first slide that you see here are annexations that are paired with rezoning requests. So on these annexations, 3 are outside of the ETJ. They tend to be large parcels. The type of development on these properties is residential. These are all, I believe, in the southeast, where you're going to have a lot of that large undeveloped land. So their fire service has, Raleigh Fire has service concerns of all types in this area, but they are outside of the ETJ except for that AX 2122, which is inside the ETJ. The next slide is 4 more annexations that'll be coming before you soon. These are all inside the ETJ, and their characteristics are a little different. The parcels are much smaller, as you can see, and each parcel has a different type of development on them. The first is a church, and these are all again, a lot of these are towards the southeast. One is a commercial development. AX 3522 on Whitfield Road is actually a pre-existing residential single-family home, and they're looking to hook up to water and sewer because the development to the north is actually interfering with their septic field, so that's why they're trying to connect. And then the very last one is an industrial space, and Raleigh Fire on these also has, Raleigh Fire has concerns on all types of fire service. So I want to zoom out a little bit so you can get a general idea of where these annexations are. So what you're looking at here is locations of pending annexation cases in the southeast. So just to orient yourself on a geography, on the right side of the screen you see that Raleigh track, that's that satellite triangle-like gray area on the right side of this illustration. The Neuse River is just to the north, and the Raleigh Water Treatment Facility would be on the very right side of that. So you can see there's some in the ETJ. There's quite a bit in the ETJ. There's a few outside of the ETJ. The city limits in that area have developed organically over the years, so there's a bit of irregularity in the lines that you see out there. If we go ahead and focus on the northeast, there are less annexations out there, but there's also less water and sewer infrastructure out there. So these annexations are inside the ETJ. Just to orient yourself on this one, if you look to the right of the screen, you see that satellite, that grayed out area, that's the Rivertown development. So I want to jump towards utility infrastructure as well. That also goes hand in hand with fire service. So I do want to talk about or touch upon the city service spectrum of services that we offer when by state, what the state requires us to do and what the city of Raleigh chooses to do. And this is when a property is annexed. If it's annexed into the city, we're required to provide water and sewer, police coverage, fire, road maintenance, and solid waste. There's some timing on that Pat had covered previously, but in terms of what Raleigh chooses to provide, that's the parks and recreation facilities and stormwater management. So when we do grow, the type of development at the periphery matters. So there are cost revenue considerations in this. And in the CESA study, there have been some growth scenarios modeled, and we'll go into greater detail on that in the next slide. But when you have a higher growth scenario, there's higher cost and more upfront capital cost to that than you have with lower growth scenarios, but the tax revenues are also much higher. And in the CESA study, they estimate that it's 8.24 times higher. And then we are looking at the CESA study area in the southeast for expansion of the ETJ. That extension is Area 1, and that extension does require a new fire station that's tied directly into the plan. But the areas closest to Raleigh's corporate limit, we talked about, and the areas closest to Raleigh's corporate limit are where you're seeing a lot of activity, but you're also seeing a lot of activity outside of the ETJ because that outer Beltline I-540 is coming through, and you've got a lot of land out there that is open and it will see future development. So that's where we're seeing most of the annexation petitions. So this is the cost revenue forecast case study that comes directly from the CESA study, and it just gives a general idea that the takeaway on this is that there's significant upfront capital costs. There are obviously recurring operating expenses, and there's timing associated with this, but it compares the low growth scenario and the high growth scenario. When you look at property tax revenue on the low growth scenario, it's upwards of $36 million, and this is over a 30-year time frame. But on the higher growth scenario, the figures show $275 million. So there's a considerable difference in terms of growth scenarios that you could have in these areas. And I want to focus a little bit too, just the connection between utilities and fire and how that relates with service and growth. So both are required with annexation, both impact fire and safety. Essentially, the enemy of fire is water. So you want to have water out there because you have hydrants that you need to connect to the network. So utility service availability is a key driver of growth in these cases, and fire service requires hydrants. So that's the takeaway there. And just a few last slides on infrastructure. I did want to note that Raleigh Water is an enterprise fund. So Raleigh Water does have the capacity to serve the lands in all these growth areas in the short-term and long-term urban service areas. They have that capacity. I do also want to mention that inside the ETJ, and this is city policy, but if an annexation is denied, the owner can still develop to city standards and connect to water and sewer, but at double rates. But that is city policy, and that's not, the state doesn't require us to do that. That's not, we're not obligated. And I want to just end this. I'll read a little bit from this, and I do hate reading from slides, but there's a lot of information here. I want to make sure you all get it. But this just relates to utility service and policy items that are referenced in the comprehensive plan that relate to extensions of the water and sewer lines. So excuse me. So the first one is 2.1, which ensures extension outside the city limits are consistent with service expansion plans, making sure that it's not in watersheds unless it's in accordance with watershed plan policies, that it's sufficient in capacity, it meets city standards, and it enhances the contiguous development of the city. The second policy looks at limiting extension outside city limits only to where there's a threat to public health and safety and welfare, or to Raleigh's drinking water supply, and also to serve merger communities and provide the ability to provide interconnects with other utility systems for use in times of drought or extreme weather. And if folks are not familiar with what merger communities are, that's a term that we use to describe other communities in Wake County mostly, where the city of Raleigh actually provides their water service. So we have lines that extend outside of the ETJ to serve merger communities like Knightdale and Garner. Right? So it's not just, water and sewer is not just focused on the city of Raleigh, but there are other communities in play. And also, finally, emergency utility extension policy, and that's, again, health and safety, allow only existing development that it's basically protecting the safety, health, and welfare of the water supply. So with that, I want to hand it over to Lorraine Eubanks with Raleigh Fire, who can go over some of these fire service slides. And she's right here. Thank you.
Hello. Lorraine Eubanks, Raleigh Fire Planning Officer. So, to set the stage, I wanted to talk about Raleigh's growth, and specifically Raleigh Fire's growth. In the past...
Can you bring the mic closer?
Oh, I'm sorry. Apologies, I'm a little bit taller. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Over the past 7 years, Raleigh Fire's call volume has increased 36%, but we've had 0% increase in new fire station infrastructure. We use 2015 as the set the stage there because the last fire station built was Fire Station 29 in 2015. So the Raleigh Fire Department is committed to excellence and adhering to the National Fire Protection Association standards. We provide emergency medical services, fire protection, rescue, emergency communications, fire prevention, community outreach, and fire and life safety education. So in terms of mutual aid, the only written mutual aid agreements are with Wake County for hazardous materials response and a service level agreement for New Hope Station 1 coverage area. All other forms of mutual aid are through informal partnerships based on the CAD system, so closest unit response to this jurisdiction. In 2022, 10.8% of all calls were for incidents outside of City of Raleigh jurisdiction. So to explain how our fire resources are deployed, RFD utilizes computer aid dispatch or CAD system. The closest unit to the incident from any jurisdiction will be dispatched initially. If an agency outside of City of Raleigh jurisdiction is the initial responder, the incident will be transferred to RFD once they arrive. The call type will dictate the initial response type. So an example of that is for a full alarm assignment. For any fire suppression incident, the initial response will always have a full alarm assignment. A full alarm consists of 4 engines or 2 ladders. Based on the incident, more units will go, or some units will be rescinded. So, 1 second. So how is fire service tied to ISO? So every 5 years, the Insurance Services Office, or ISO, will rate the Raleigh Fire Department on how prepared the community in the area is for fire-related incidents. The key areas that are scored are emergency communications, fire department operations, water supply, and community risk reduction. All in all, a better ISO rating equals higher commitment to fire service excellence and lower insurance premiums. So I mentioned NFPA earlier, or National Fire Protection Association standards. These are guiding metrics that all fire departments and EMS agencies use for emergency response. In terms of these pending annexation cases, there are 3 NFPA standards that we're focusing on, and I'll read those just because we'll refer to those later. The NFPA 1710 4.1.2.1 Section 3 means 240 seconds or 4 minutes or less travel time for the first engine company at the fire suppression incident. Section 4 refers to 360 seconds or 6 minutes or less of travel time for the arrival of the second company with minimum staffing of 4 personnel. And then Section 5 refers to, for other than a high-rise, 480 seconds or 8 minutes or less for travel time deployment for a full alarm assignment. And if you remember, a full alarm assignment is 4 engines and 2 aerial ladders. So besides identifying the NFPA standards, Planning and Fire have come up with some criteria options to notate the status of capital planning in the area or fire planning. It would either be no active planning, or there is planning but no defined timeline, or there is active planning with a defined date. So this chart shows the current pending annexation cases, so all 8 of them that we're discussing here, and the NFPA standards that they are meeting and not meeting, as well as if there are planning efforts ongoing. Based on this chart, you'll notice that all 8 cases do not meet the Section 5 of full alarm assignment NFPA standard. So to zoom in a little bit in the southeast, we determined that the second company response, Section 4 NFPA standard, was averaging over 8 minutes, and that standard refers to 6 minutes response. An example of that is AX 2222, 3540 Auburn-Knightdale Road. The second company will not arrive to the incident until 10 minutes after the initial dispatch. In the Northeast specifically, the latter response is averaging over 11 minutes. And a good example of this is AX 2122, 7640 Oak Hill Drive. The closest ladder apparatus will not arrive until 12 minutes after the initial dispatch. So based on response times in current fire station locations, we determined some short-term and long-term needs Raleigh Fire needs as we grow. So short-term would be an additional ladder apparatus in the Northeast and at least 1 temporary station in the Southeast. in the Southeast, excuse me. And long-term is just permanent fire infrastructure. So 1 station at least in the Northeast and 2 stations in the Southeast. These stations would be fully equipped and staffing. And what comes with new infrastructure comes with cost. So as you can see on this slide, we have estimated related costs to building and sustaining fire stations and including a temporary station during construction. I want to note that these costs include escalation based off of current market value and what we've seen over time. And all in all, including a temporary station, it would be approximately over $30 million this is for 1 station, to build 1 station. And I'll hand it over to Bynum.
Thanks, Lorraine. Bynum Walter, Planning and Development. Good afternoon. I want to just talk through with you. We've heard a little bit about context. We know who's asking you for what. And I think the next question is, well, what do we do about that? What are our options? So I want to talk a little bit about this. So you have kind of 5 big buckets of choices here. You could deny the request for annexation that's outside the ETJ. I'll walk through the pros and cons of each of these. You could deny request for annexation inside the ETJ. You could deny and also move forward with ETJ relinquishment if the request is already in our ETJ. You could defer action, have a number of public hearings open. You could leave those open and wait to make a decision until you have more plan developed in terms of how we might provide service. You could approve with a delayed effective date, and that would also delay delivery of service. So I'll walk through each of these a little bit more. So denial outside the ETJ. This is consistent with city policy not to extend utilities or provide service outside the ETJ. In that circumstance, Wake County would remain responsible for regulation and permitting and provision of all services. This limits development options on that land, right? So if they're getting service from the county, they're probably getting water either from septic or a package plant, and so the density is not going to be comparable to what could be achieved with city service. People are going to keep asking for annexation in the areas outside the ETJ, and really, if you're making a denial of an annexation, you're going to lose that future tax revenue, and you're probably not going to get another bite at voluntary annexation if you deny once, because the only motivation to ask for annexation is that you want that water and sewer service. And then it also creates the possibility for donut holes in the future if the ETJ is expanded. And we all know that just complicates service. It makes confusion about who's where and what they are entitled to. Now, denial inside the ETJ is a little bit different. So property would still develop to city standards. It would remain in Wake County service. There'd be no additional obligation for fire, police, solid waste, stormwater, those kinds of things. But we still would be obligated to allow connection to water and sewer. So if you're in the ETJ and you ask for annexation, whether or not we say yes, you get water and sewer. If you don't get the annexation, you pay a higher rate for your water and sewer, but you still get access to that service. That's how we've operated, how the city has operated historically. Now, as I mentioned before, once you deny that request for annexation, you're probably not going to get that chance again. So that really reduces future opportunity for voluntary annexation of a particular parcel. You're not going to get the property tax revenue, and again, you definitely are making donut holes, which are make an inefficiency of service. So a different scenario is you deny things, and you also direct staff to pursue ETJ relinquishment. So this would really be sending a very clear signal about the city's intent not to serve a particular area. It does require the relinquishment process and renegotiation of our annexation agreements. That's a lot of work for you. It's a lot of work for the county commissioners. It's a lot of political time over what might be actually a very small amount of acreage. The other downside there is you are losing control of what the form of the development might look like, and also leaving the door open that another jurisdiction might annex that area, and we might see Garner or Knightdale development standards rather than Raleigh standards there. It could also very likely limit future opportunities for ETJ expansion. So if the county sees that we have a history of not being willing to serve areas that are already in our ETJ, I think they might interpret that as concern about our willingness to serve anything that we would expand our ETJ into. Do we really mean it? Do we really intend to serve? And then if development happens as part of a merger community as a result of the relinquishment, then Raleigh Water would still be serving, right? So we still are providing, bearing that burden without the benefit of controlling development or yielding, collecting the tax revenue. So the couple of options for how you might, if you want to make approvals, how you might structure those. So one option is to defer your decision. You're you're putting that decision farther down the road. You're leaving a public hearing open. We have petitions pending, and you leave that public hearing open for a period of time while you make more plans for how to successfully serve. Remember, water and sewer has to be delivered within 3.5 years. Fire, police, solid waste all have to be delivered the date of effective annexation. That can be delivered either directly by the city or via contract, but this would give you time to make those plans. So the advantage here, we're being really open and upfront about the limits on service in the interim. It's giving you more time to budget and plan. You still get the advantage of the future property tax revenue, and there's an opportunity here for partnerships for temporary, for partnerships or for temporary solutions. The downside, it's going to take some time to do that work, and ultimately you're committing to the increased service costs for the city. If you're anticipating approval in the future, there's going to be costs to provide service. And then it's creating, maintains kind of some uncertainty for property owners, right? Well, what will be the timeline? When will we know? How will this resolve, right? And then a final option is also an approval option, but it would be an approval with a delayed effective date of annexation, recognizing that if you made an approval on an annexation today, there are places where we would not be able to deliver fire, police, solid waste on day one, comparable to what's already adjacent, right? So what's good about this? It establishes a date certain for delivery of service. It's more certain for property owners. We get the increased property tax revenue. This has a lot of the downsides similar to the deferral. It takes time to implement service. We're going to have to get that work done. The costs are going to go up. There's going to be a limited period of service during the interim before the annexation takes effect, and we know that that's likely to result in higher insurance premiums, particularly related to fire for property owners during that interim. So those are the kind of big buckets of options for you to consider as you're thinking about these individual petitions. I do think, Christopher called out some of the, one of the petitions is for a single-family home. So I could see where you might have thoughts about the individual disposition of the cases might also affect your decisions, in addition to sort of this macro-level framework of annexation, regulation, and service provision. So, thank you. And Pat and Christopher and I are here to take questions as you need.
Definitely thank all of you for the information and feedback. I have some questions, but I'm going to go to other council members first. Councilman Harris.
Yeah, thank you. That was super helpful. Bynum, could you go back to, there was a slide, I think, earlier on about costs or revenues that we might be getting depending on whether it's a low growth or a high growth scenario. I was just trying to read it, all those numbers quickly.
Mm-hmm. This one.
There.
Yeah. And
okay.
I would just put a very large caveat on this, that the property tax revenues are very, very hard to estimate here. Mm-hmm. This is establishing kind of a range. This is not a certainty. It could also be outside the range. It's based on a lot of assumptions, right? But we all felt like we had to put some kind of numbers in this presentation to give you some frame of reference. I would say the costs are much more predictable than the revenues.
Bynum, let me add to that. If I may.
Okay.
Yeah, Bynum's of course right. Pat Young again with Planning and Development. I think what's an important context here, you're going to hopefully today schedule the hearing on the Southeast Special Study Area, CESA. A big part of that study was this idea of encouraging and requiring denser, nodal, higher value growth so that we get closer towards this high end rather than low end. In areas, for example, as a previous council heard, when 540 was extended in Western Wake, the communities out there decided to allow almost exclusively single-family development, which is often revenue negative growth because it doesn't have enough value and mixture of uses to support the service levels required. So we're making very intentional efforts to try to move towards that higher growth side through the CESA process that you'll hear more about. So I just wanted to emphasize that. That's not a guarantee, but it's certainly our intention.
Okay. So just to clarify, the tax revenues, so this is going to be annual, so 36.5 million in the low growth, 275 million high growth annual for, this is the southeast areas 1 through 4. So we're not talking about northeast right now.
Correct.
And this is the southeast areas that are relevant to the study area?
Correct.
Okay, so it's not just the current annexations that we're thinking about, it's that whole entire area.
That's right. We had already done the work as part of the Southeast study and brought that into this conversation for reference. I just want to note, this is a 30-year time frame. This is not annual.
Oh, that's not annual.
That's
I'm
not
sorry.
annual
Oh, okay,
revenue.
Right. Okay, very different.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. So,
Yeah, you think it looks good until you realize it's 30 years. Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm going to stop there.
Any other council members with questions? Councilor Patton, do you have
I'm trying.
a? Yeah.
I'm trying to get my head wrapped around what my question is. So if anyone else, please go first.
So I have a question. Actually, it goes back to the fire stations and building a fire station, and it takes, roughly 30 million. My question is, how long from money being approved for a fire station, how long from that point does it take to build?
Chief Griffin is here. He's going to answer your question.
Good afternoon, Herbert Griffin, Raleigh Fire. To answer your question, Councilmember Branch, from exception to close, you're looking 3 to 4 years for infrastructure build, assets in place, closing out the actual build of a fire station, because that happens 1 year later after the station's already in service.
Okay. And my other question while you're there, for the Area 1 of the Southeast Area Study, kind of up to that Randleman track, is there water already in that area?
That I'm unsure of. I'm not sure.
Okay. Is
Probably
there
get with
anyone
Raleigh
that can-
Water to answer that
Yeah,
question.
is anyone
for you.
from Raleigh Water can answer that question? Or get back
I'm just
with
gonna pull the
us?
slide up. I can't answer it, but just to make sure we all know what we're talking about here. It's that
Yeah, the area that that area right there. I'm just asking, is there water already in that area? And I'm assuming the Randleman track, if we have a Wake County and a Raleigh facility sitting there, there's probably water so that's what I'm asking.
I can speak to that somewhat. There is water and sewer in those areas. I can't say exactly where they are, but there is infrastructure in those areas. Some of that infrastructure goes out to merger communities and goes to the water and sewer treatment plant.
Okay.
So that's the area we're going to see the most infrastructure. So that's the area that you're also going to see the most pressure, because obviously the infrastructure growth is, the water and sewer infrastructure that's out there is a driver of growth. And if you look at that northeast, on the northeast area, on the top of the screen with the red circle, there's not as much water and sewer out there, so hence not as much growth pressure.
Okay. Can we get more information, a manager's update about the water infrastructure in that area? Any other questions?
Yes, I'm ready now. So following up on the $30 million it takes to provide one station, we just had a budget work session yesterday where we're going to run up against some budget shortfalls. What are funding opportunities for fire stations? Can those only be provided by the general fund? Can we fund them through a bond?
So our capital infrastructure is typically funded through our CIP budget, which is a 5-year projection. And what we would do is we phase that cost, and we have the opportunity to get creative in how we fund projects that are in the CIP.
Okay, great. And then one of the main downsides that Bynum mentioned in the approval with delay options was like the work needs to get done. What is a loose ballpark of how long that work would need to be done? A year, 2 years, 6 months?
I think the primary constraint is getting the fire service up and going, and you heard from the chief that would be 3 to 4 years. I do think, as you also heard from Bynum, another alternative that is at least possible or could be explored further is having temporary or interim service or through a partnership like with Wake County, for example. I think the bottom line is approval of any of these within the next several years is if the annexation effective date is within that time period, we're not going to meet the fire service standards you heard about from Lorraine. So I think we would probably have to talk about both interim service, if you all want to proceed with approving these, with interim service agreements, partnerships, temporary service, and then also a capital plan to put in the permanent infrastructure. Did that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think a follow-up is like making that plan for the interim. Like, are there templates? Is this something that's easily teed up and ready to go to provide those interim services, or is that a lengthy process?
Yeah, I'd have to defer my colleagues in fire that there are challenges and opportunities.
So to answer your question, Pat, Mr. mentioned that we could do a temporary station, right? But you would be using existing assets currently, right? Like a reserve truck to go into an existing station, and normally that takes 9 months to implement. But that's with a long-term commitment to build a new fire station there. And a temporary station only grants you about 2 years service time before the infrastructure starts to dilapidate.
Understood. Thank you. That's helpful.
Follow-up question on that is, when we get the Southeast Raleigh area study back, are there going to be action items or ways to address some of these interim service options in that plan? Like, are we going to have another touch point on this there and maybe have some opportunity to act?
I'm not certain if that is currently planned for. Pat, help me out. If not, staff can make some adjustments to bring back something that speaks directly to that, but I don't know that it is currently planned in the plan.
That's right, Madam Manager, you've addressed it. I think the plan was following our 30-year commitment to servicing the area, and we didn't go into detail on a certain specific service requirement. We can certainly add that in. When we come back, we're recommending April 4th, I believe it is, whatever your Tuesday meeting is.
Mm-hmm. And then the only other thing I wanted to flag is, I think that this is one of the very obvious examples of what happens when we sprawl, because we're pushing far and far out. And so it makes it harder to provide the services that are required. It's a greater strain on the city and our budget. And, I understand that land is cheaper in these areas and that one size doesn't fit all for housing. But this is, I think, why it's really important to continue our policies that allow for infill and other types of growth in our urban cores already, because this is not a sustainable way to grow the city. But it is the development trends we have right now, and so we need to plan for it. And the other piece I wanted to flag is, I know that this presentation really focused on fire and some other required services. We haven't even talked about transit and how we're going to run buses out here. We had a whole discussion at our retreat about a service model versus a frequency model, or both. And so there are so many other issues that this type of sprawl triggers that we can't even talk about today. And so we really need to be looking at it holistically. I hope maybe that can be, I know it's in more areas than just Southeast Raleigh, but we have that Southeast Raleigh area study already happening. So hopefully that will be an opportunity for us to have some action items. But I do think, again, not thinking in silos, every time we make a decision about what can happen within city limits or infill, it's directly affecting whether we can head off some of these development trends in the future, I think.
Absolutely, and to that point, there are additional services that are going to be required as well. Police, solid waste services. So as we extend and grow out, we have to grow the staff or extend them beyond what we're currently providing in our current service models. So, there is a cost of growth, and we just need to figure out what that balance is and what we're comfortable with, but before it gets to a point it's financially unstable and not sustainable.
Yeah, Councilmember, just to pick up where the city manager just was, the Southeast Area Plan does go into some detail on how to accomplish nodal development, transit-supported development, mixed-use development, as you just said, for all the reasons you said, and you're absolutely right. What's not currently in the plan is this service delivery cost model in detail, so we can layer that in, certainly for the fire services initially, and then if you all want to have more work in those other areas, we'll add that in over time.
All right. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask about the municipal service agreements that we would have with Wake County. Is there a cost associated with that? And how much would that be to have Wake County handle if we were to annex it and then utilize their services?
Currently, right now, we have a friendship agreement, I'll say that, with Wake County. The only service level agreement we have is with New Hope, Station Number 1, which we provide fire service for them. We have a mutual aid agreement, and that's the only one with Wake County. We provide them hazmat services to Wake County. If Wake County was to call us today, they would get fire, rescue, hazmat, regardless. We send them everything. So it's not marginalized to one thing. So we have to sit there and work with them on the response plan as it relates to annexation, potential areas. But can we do it? Yes. But that's not guaranteed that Wake County assets would be in service when the need comes.
And that's not to say that there would be money associated with that need that we would have with Wake County. They may not, I don't know what the friendly agreement is, but that may not result in money. Like they
It
would
may or
charge
may
us,
not.
but,
The New Hope service level agreement does have a financial capacity to it. But that would be on Wake County to see, okay, if they want to extend services for a financial cost.
Okay, thank you.
So a couple questions. I was, I think, the only one on council when we first asked for this Southeast Raleigh area study, and I was actually the one that asked for it because I saw what was happening in western Wake County with 540 and the impact it had on the community. So my first question is, to ask you for the fire chief, if we were to have something to happen in that area now, and Wake County, I saw in the report based on what you said, if Wake County, wasn't available based on what you said, we would be responding anyway, right?
That is correct.
All right, so if anything happens to this day, we respond.
That's correct.
Okay, so with that also being said, my question is, based upon the impact of 540, if we extend this or not, would you recommend a new fire station in this area anyway?
100%.
Okay.
You're asking a fire chief if he wants a new fire station. Think about what you're saying, Mayor Pro Tem.
1,000%.
I'm just asking questions. And my other question is, I know transportation, I don't think transportation's here, but the thing as far as bus service in the area.
Michael's here.
Michael's here? Okay, I see Michael's here. As far as, I know we run a bus already out to Battle Ridge. We just started that service a couple years ago. And I think Battle Ridge from this end of the city limits is probably a mile or so. But my question is, what is the overall plan? Because this area is the focus of attention because it's the one we're talking about now. But what's the plan for Raleigh? Because there's a lot of other areas in Raleigh currently to this day that don't have bus service.
Mayor Pro Tem, that's a great question. As you know, we routinely put together an update to the bus plan. This would be an area of focus for the next version of that. I think we have one that we have anticipated a number of improvements in Southeast Raleigh, given some of the growth and potential areas there to do more park and ride, just into downtown. But that would be an area that we would include in the next update of the bus plan.
Thank you. My next question is for Pat. Normally from the time that a project, we're talking about annexation, what's required at annexation, but when a project is being built, from the time, I guess, site plan is done, because someone could come in today and say, hey, I want to build in this area within our ETJ on the edges, and it not just by right. From that time, normally how long does it take for development from site plan to they giving someone a key to walk
Yeah,
through the door?
so there's a lot of, that's a good question. There's a lot of variability in that depending on the size, scale of the development and the type of development. I would say the average from the time of site plan approval to the first occupancy is about 18 months, somewhere in that time frame. Could be 24. I think the underlying issue is we would need to feel that at the time the permit is applied for that we could provide the service.
Right.
And that would usually come much earlier, kind of usually within months of the of a zoning action, for example.
Okay. So thank you. So the point of me asking those questions is this is the chance for us finally, out of all these years, to get in front of development. And I really think we have some things that we're going to have to address and deal with as we go forward. And I think as a council, there's some direction that we're going to have to provide to the staff as far as how we phase covering this area. Actually, I'm sorry, Pat, I did have one more question. How long has it been since this area has been marked for future Raleigh annexation?
Right, so the initial planning and agreements that identified this as an urban service area was late 80s, early 90s. It was reinforced and enhanced with the 2020 or 21 Wake County Comprehensive Plan that was more specific about whether it should be rural, mixed-use center, that kind of thing. But the original concept's been about 30 years.
Okay, all right. So 30 years is here. I know we're dealing with sprawl, but as we're growing, Clayton is growing to the west, Garner's growing. So I definitely want to thank staff today for the presentation. I think it gives us all as council members things to think about, direction that we need to give. You know, this was about a fire station. We also have to think about equipment. You know, when we talk about engines and ladder trucks, there's certain things that we can do sooner than later as far as moving forward. So are there any other questions from any council members? Counselor, I saw you first.
Just real quick, if there could be some kind of basic benefit cost analysis provided, even with, you know, the most uncertain of numbers, that might help just thinking about, you know, into the long term, these areas and what it means for our revenues and expenses.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think that there's a case in my district that is a rezoning and not an annexation yet. I think that one of the applicants is here. Is there any nuance or any difference between like an approach to that because it's a rezoning but not an annexation yet versus these ones that are leading with the annexation?
So parcels that are in the ETJ and they already have city zoning, and so they can ask for different city zoning without requesting annexation. Typically, we see parcels in that situation either ask concurrently, or they ask for the rezoning and then ask for the annexation later. Nobody wants to start paying tax before they have to, right? Before they take service. So there's technically no reason they can't ask for rezoning without the annexation, without delaying the annexation question until later. And we always flag in the staff reports whether or not a rezoning request is in the ETJ or in the city limits. So you have that information as part of informing your decision about the rezoning request.
So because they're in the ETJ, they already have access to water and sewer.
Only if they ask for annexation.
Right, annexation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Any other counselors, questions? If not, thank you all. Thank you, staff. This was for our discussion information purposes for us to make future decisions. This is the only item we have. City manager, you have anything else?
That is it.
City attorneys, you have anything?
No, sir.
All right, we are adjourned.